"Leave them on the trail," the stepmother sneered, her voice cold as the frost on the pine needles. Constance pushed Emily and her sister Lily out of the wagon and onto the wet shoulder of the road. Down in the freezing mud of the Oregon Trail, Emily gripped her sister tight. She watched the heavy wooden wheels of the wagon roll forward, churning through the muck. Their father, Robert, sat hunched on the driver's bench in silent defeat, his hands limp on the reins, refusing to look back as their only home disappeared into the damp gloom. The freezing rain soaked their thin clothes, and Lily began coughing, a raspy sound that sent a jolt of panic through Emily's heart. Abandoned with no food, no blankets, and only the dark wall of pine trees ahead, they stood frozen. The physical threat of the harsh frontier autumn hung heavy in the air as the wagon became a distant speck in the cold rain. The mist deepened as the afternoon wore on, turning the towering pines into ghostly shapes that closed in on the narrow trail. The scent of damp earth, rotting needles, and wet moss filled the cold air, a sharp reminder of the vast wilderness that lay between them and safety. Lily's breath came in shallow, labored gasps, her small hand clutching Emily's fingers with a freezing grip. Emily's boots were thin, the leather worn through at the soles, allowing the icy water of the mud to seep in and numb her toes. She knew they could not stay on the open trail, where the wind swept down from the snow-dusted peaks, so she led Lily into the thick forest, hoping the canopy of spruce and pine would offer some shelter from the steady, freezing rain. Every step was a battle against the slippery mud and the sharp briars that tore at their skirts, but Emily kept her eyes fixed ahead, searching the grey shadows for any sign of shelter. The forest was silent, save for the heavy patter of rain and the occasional groan of a dying branch, making their isolation feel complete and absolute. As twilight faded into a pitch-black night, the cold grew sharper, biting through Emily's thin shawl and making Lily's limbs stiffen. Lily's strength gave out, her knees buckling under her as she let out a soft whimper of pain, her forehead burning with a sudden fever. Emily did not hesitate. She knelt in the wet dirt, took Lily's hands, and hoisted the frail girl onto her back, her own knees trembling under the weight. She carried Lily over fallen logs and through thickets of wild blackberry bushes that scratched her wrists and face, leaving thin, stinging scratches. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her lungs aching from the cold air, but she refused to stop, driven by the knowledge that to lie down in the dark was to never wake up. She stumbled over a root, falling onto the damp earth, but managed to twist her body in the air to take the brunt of the fall, cradling Lily against her chest to shield her. They lay under the sweeping boughs of a massive fallen spruce tree, the branches forming a low cave that kept off the worst of the rain. Emily wrapped her arms around Lily, whispering soft stories of their mother and a warm kitchen they had lost, praying for a miracle to see the dawn. The night under the spruce was an eternity of shivering and dark, cold silence, broken only by the mournful hoot of an owl and the distant lonely howl of a wolf high up on the ridge. The wind howled through the high branches, shaking heavy drops of water onto Emily's face, each droplet feeling like a needle of ice against her cold skin. She held Lily tight, using her own body as a shield against the drafts, her hands rubbing Lily's back in a slow motion to restore the warmth. The air smelled of wet spruce and the metallic tang of old leaves, a scent Emily would associate with the boundary between life and death. Lily murmured in her feverish sleep, calling out for their father and asking why the wagon had not stopped, her small voice cracking with thirst. Emily pressed her cheek against Lily's hot forehead, whispering that the morning would bring warmth, though she feared they would both be frozen before the sun cleared the peaks. Her own fingers had lost all feeling, yet she clamped them tight around her sister's wool coat, refusing to let go when sleep threatened to drag her under. Staring into the blackness, she counted the slow, heavy beats of her own heart, keeping death at bay. The morning arrived with a pale silver frost that coated the forest floor, turning every pine needle into a delicate frozen sculpture. Emily's limbs were so stiff she could barely shift her weight, her joints aching with a dull, heavy pain as she tried to sit up under the spruce boughs. Just as the grey fog began to drift between the tree trunks, the quiet forest was filled with a sound that made Emily's heart flutter, the rhythmic thud of hooves and the creak of saddle leather. Out of the swirling mist, rode a man on a large, heavy-boned horse, its breath coming in thick clouds of steam. Caleb Vance rode with his head low against the wind, his wide-brimmed hat pulled down to shadow his face, which was carved with the deep, hard lines of a man who had lived too long in the wilderness. His dark eyes, sharp and cautious, scanned the forest floor until they caught the flash of Emily's grey wool skirt beneath the fallen spruce. He pulled back the reins, the heavy horse snorting and pawing the ground, and for a long moment Caleb simply sat in the saddle, looking down at the shivering sisters with a stern, silent gaze. He did not speak a word of comfort, nor did he offer the easy sympathy that a town-bred man might have given. The frontier had long since burned such things out of him, leaving only the hard, practical shell of a survivalist. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his heavy leather boots crunching on the frozen pine needles, and walked toward the shelter with a slow, measured stride. He knelt in the damp dirt, the scent of horse sweat, leather, and wood smoke clinging to his canvas coat as he reached under the branches. Without asking permission, he slid his strong, calloused hands under Lily's limp form, lifting the feverish girl as easily as if she were a bundle of kindling. He wrapped her in his own heavy oilskin coat, her small head resting against his chest as he placed her carefully across the pommel of his saddle. Then he turned his dark eyes onto Emily, his face expressionless. "Get up," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble like stones scraping together in a riverbed. And though the words were brief, there was a quiet authority in them that gave Emily the strength to stand. He did not offer his hand, but he waited, holding the horse's bridle, until Emily stood trembling beside him, her knuckles white against the saddle. The ride to the homestead was a silent, slow progression through the rising hills, the heavy horse walking with a steady pace that jarred Emily's sore frame with every step. Caleb walked on foot, leading the horse by the rein, his long strides eating up the distance without a single sign of fatigue. The wind blew cold from the north, whistling through the high pines and bringing with it the scent of coming snow, but Caleb did not look back to check on Emily, who walked close behind the horse's flank to shield herself from the wind. Her fingers were curled into the coarse hair of the horse's tail, using the animal's warmth to keep her hands from freezing entirely as they climbed the rocky path. They crossed a shallow creek, where the water ran clear and cold over smooth grey stones, the horse splashing through the shallows with a heavy, rhythmic sound. As they climbed higher, the trees began to thin, revealing a steep, wind-swept ridge overlooking a wide, empty valley below. Perched on the edge of this ridge sat Caleb's homestead, a lonely cabin built of dark, rough-hewn pine logs that looked as though they had been chopped from the forest, only to be forgotten by the world. The homestead bore the unmistakable marks of long neglect and silent grief, its fence lines sagging into the tall brown grass, and the small barn standing with its door hanging loose on a single iron hinge. The small garden patch beside the cabin was completely choked with wild briars and thick oak scrub, their thorny branches reaching out like skeletal fingers over the rich, dark soil. Several shingles were missing from the cabin roof, leaving a gap where the winter rains would surely seep in, and the window panes were dark and dusty, reflecting nothing but the grey sky. Caleb led the horse to the cabin door, which was made of thick, unpainted oak timber and secured with a heavy iron latch. He lifted Lily down from the saddle, carrying her inside with the same quiet efficiency, while Emily followed closely, her eyes wide as she took in the cold, sparse interior. The cabin consisted of a single room, dominated by a stone fireplace that was cold and filled with grey ashes from a fire that had died weeks ago. A rough wooden table stood in the centre of the room, accompanied by 2 chairs, and in the corner a simple, narrow bed lay covered in a faded wool quilt that had once been bright with colour. Caleb laid Lily on the bed, immediately pulling the faded quilt over her shivering shoulders, and then turned his attention to the cold stone hearth. He knelt, his hands moving quickly as he cleared a space in the grey ash and stacked split cedar kindling. He struck a match, the small flame catching the dry cedar and flaring up with a warm light that cast long shadows across the log walls. The scent of sweet cedar smoke and burning pitch soon filled the room, a welcome warmth that chased the icy dread from Emily's chest as she stood near the hearth holding her hands out to the flames. Caleb did not speak as he worked, blowing gently on the embers until the fire caught a log of split hickory, the wood cracking as the heat began to fill the room. He took a tin cup, filled it with water from a bucket, and added dried herbs from a jar before placing it near the edge of the hot stones. Only when the tea was ready did he speak, handing the cup to Emily and pointing toward the bed where Lily lay. "Give her this," he muttered. "The heat will break the fever, and the herbs will quiet the rattle in her chest." Emily fed the warm tea to Lily, spoon by spoon, watching as her sister's breathing gradually became deeper and less raspy under the heavy quilt. Caleb stood by the door, his arms crossed over his chest as he watched them, his shadow stretching long and dark across the floorboards. The silence between them was heavy, filled only with the crackle of the wood fire and the patter of the rain outside. Caleb cleared his throat, a dry, raspy sound, and looked out the window at the overgrown garden patch. "My wife Sarah passed away when the leaves first started to turn," he said, his voice flat, but his eyes lingering on the empty chair by the window. "Since then, the cabin has gone to seed, and I've had no time to clear the ridge. I need the lower field cleared of briars and the rocks pulled so I can turn the soil, but my own chores keep me from the work, and the land is stubborn." He looked back at Emily, his gaze hard. "I don't keep freeloaders, and the town is 3 days' ride in a wagon that's currently missing a wheel. If you stay here, you work." Emily looked from Caleb's stern face to Lily, who had finally fallen into a quiet sleep. She knew they had no other choice. The trail was a graveyard for the weak, and the wagon was long gone, leaving them with nothing but the clothes they wore. "I can clear the fields," Emily said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, her chin lifted in a gesture of quiet pride. "I will pull the roots and clear the stones so you can plant your crops. In exchange, I ask only for a warm place for Lily to sleep, a share of your rations of cornmeal and salt pork, and your protection from the cold." Caleb stared at her, as if measuring the weight of her resolve against the hardness of the soil. He nodded once, a brief, decisive motion that sealed the agreement. "The loft is dry," he said simply. "There is straw for a mattress, and the iron skillet is by the stove. You start at dawn, and I don't want to hear any whining about the cold or the weight of the stones." With those words he turned and walked out, leaving the sisters with the warmth of the fire and the hard promise of tomorrow. The next morning, the sun rose cold and pale, casting long, watery shadows across the overgrown ridge as Emily climbed down from the loft. She walked out into the yard, her arms wrapped around herself against the bite of the mountain wind, but she stopped short as a low growl vibrated through the quiet air. Near the woodpile stood Silas, a scarred and weathered hound dog, whose grey muzzle and yellow, suspicious eyes spoke of years spent guarding the homestead from wolves and strangers alike. The dog's ears were notched from old fights, and his ribs showed thin beneath a dull coat that had been stained with the red dirt of the valley. He stood with his front legs braced, his lips curled back to reveal yellowed teeth, his growl rising in pitch as Emily took a step forward. The dog had been Caleb's sole companion through the lonely months of his grief, and he clearly saw the sisters as intruders who had no right to tread on the ground Sarah had once walked. Emily froze, her heart hammering against her ribs as she looked into the beast's hostile eyes, knowing that a single mistake would bring the hound lunge at her in defense. As she watched the dog, Emily noticed that he was holding his front left paw off the ground, trembling with a painful tension. A thick, black thorn from a wild blackberry bush was embedded deep in the soft grey pad of his paw, the surrounding skin swollen and red. Emily's fear softened into pity. She knew what it was to carry a hidden pain while the world looked on with indifference. She stepped back slowly, keeping her movements predictable, and went back into the cabin where the smell of frying salt pork was beginning to rise. She cut a small piece of the pork, the grease coating her fingers, and walked back out, holding the meat on her open palm. Silas watched with narrowed eyes, his tail stiff, but the salty scent reached his nose, and his nostrils flared in the cold air. Emily knelt in the frost, keeping her head low in submission, and spoke to him in a soft whisper that was barely louder than the wind in the pines. "Easy, boy," she whispered, her voice a gentle murmur that seemed to soothe the dog's suspicion. "I'm not here to take what's yours. I only want to help." Silas hesitated, his yellow eyes darting from her face to the salt pork on her hand, his ears dropping as the growl died away into a low whine. He took a slow, limping step forward, his hot breath brushing against his skin before his teeth closed around the meat. While he chewed, Emily slowly reached out her other hand, her fingers light against the thick fur of his neck, before sliding her hand down to touch his injured leg. The dog flinched, a sharp whine escaping his throat, but he did not pull away as Emily lifted the swollen paw. With a quick, firm tug, she pulled the blackthorn free, and Silas let out a sigh of relief, his tail giving a hesitant thump against the ground, and from that moment on, the old hound became Emily's constant shadow, watching over her while she worked. The work of clearing the ridge was a brutal, bone-shattering ordeal that tested the limits of Emily's strength and endurance from the very first strike of the iron mattock. The soil was a stubborn mix of clay and river rock, held fast by the dense, tangled roots of wild oak scrub and blackberry brambles that seemed to fight back against her efforts. She rose each morning before the sun had cleared the ridge, the air so cold her breath froze in white plumes before her face. As she gripped the heavy oak handle of the tool Caleb had sharpened for her, every swing of the mattock sent a jarring shock up her arms, leaving her muscles screaming with an ache that did not fade, even when she lay down to sleep. The sharp thorns of the wild briars tore at her wool sleeves and scratched her forearms, leaving long red welts that stung when the sweat ran into them. Her hands, once soft and unaccustomed to such labor, quickly broke out in painful blisters that she wrapped in strips of old linen to keep the dirt out, the cloth marked by her toil before the skin eventually hardened into thick, yellow calluses. The smell of damp soil and crushed weeds rose from the broken earth with every swing, a constant presence that filled her senses as she worked under the vast, uncaring sky. She worked with a slow, relentless rhythm, prying at the stubborn roots and hauling the heavy boulders to the edge of the field to build a low stone wall that would mark the garden boundary. The rocks were massive, embedded deep in the damp earth like teeth, requiring her to use an iron crowbar to leverage them, her boots slipping on the wet clay as she strained. Often, she would work for hours on a single patch of ground, her breath coming in heavy gasps as the pile of cleared brush grew taller behind her. Lily, though still weak from her illness, sat on a dry log near the edge of the woods, wrapped in a blanket and keeping Silas company while the dog kept his eyes on the forest. The old hound would occasionally walk over to Emily, nudging her hand with his wet nose to offer a brief moment of encouragement before returning to his watch. Caleb watched her progress from a distance as he went about his chores, his expression hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but he did not offer to take the mattock, respecting the covenant they had made. On the 5th day of her labor, Emily encountered a massive pine stump directly in the center of the plot, its taproot running deep into the earth like an anchor. She worked for hours with the mattock and shovel, digging a trench until her arms trembled, and sweat soaked through her collar despite the biting wind. The roots were too thick to chop, and when she tried to leverage the stump with the crowbar, the iron bar bent, the wood refusing to budge. She leaned against the shovel, her chest heaving as she wiped the sweat from her eyes, her spirit beginning to flag under the weight of the land. Just as she felt the sting of tears behind her eyelids, a shadow fell over the trench, and she looked up to see Caleb standing on the edge of the hole. He carried a heavy double-bitted axe and a length of hemp rope from the barn. Stepping down into the mud beside her, the smell of pine pitch and leather surrounding him, he took the shovel from her hands. He began to chop at the thick roots with powerful rhythmic swings of the axe, the white wood chips flying from the trench and landing in the mud. Emily did not stand idle. She grabbed the crowbar and positioned it under the main root, using her weight to lift the wood as Caleb struck, their movements falling into a silent, cooperative rhythm. Together, they labored in the dark hole for over an hour, their breath mingling in a single white cloud as the afternoon light faded to purple. With a final, cracking groan, the massive roots split apart, and Caleb wrapped the hemp rope around the stump, hitching it to his heavy horse. The horse strained against the harness, its hooves digging deep into the wet sod, and with a loud suck of mud, the stump was ripped from the earth. Caleb unhitched the rope and looked at Emily, his face splattered with mud but his eyes holding a steady respect. "You've got grit, girl," he said, his voice quiet but firm, and Emily felt a warm spark of pride that chased away the cold ache in her frame. By the time the last of the autumn leaves had fallen, leaving the hills bare, A neat patch of dark, tilled earth lay ready on the ridge, its borders marked by the low stone wall Emily had built. The soil was clean and smelled of deep earth and cold rain, free of the choking weeds and rocks. Caleb brought out several burlap sacks from the root cellar, their fabric smelling of dust and dry earth, and dumped them onto the porch. Inside were dozens of seed potatoes, their skin wrinkled and covered in pale eyes ready to sprout. Caleb sat on the step with a pocket knife, showing Emily how to cut the potatoes into chunks, ensuring each piece had at least one eye. "You don't want to cut them too small," he explained, his fingers moving with ease, "or they'll rot in the damp ground. Each piece needs enough meat to feed the sprout until the leaves reach the sun." Emily sat beside him, her knife moving through the cool body of the potatoes, the sharp, clean scent of the cut tubers filling the cold air. The planting was a race against the calendar, for the dark clouds promised an early winter, and the ground was already beginning to stiffen with the first signs of freeze. Emily and Lily worked side by side, the young girl carrying a wooden bucket of the cut potato starts, while Emily walked ahead, digging shallow trenches. Lily would reach into the bucket with her small hands and drop a piece of potato into the trench, spacing them exactly a foot apart. Emily followed behind, pulling the rich, damp earth over the seed starts, her muscles moving in a smooth, practiced motion. Silas walked the perimeter of the field, his tail thumping against the low stone wall whenever Lily called to him. The wind blew cold and sharp, whistling through the empty branches of the surrounding pines, but the sisters did not stop, their hands red and numb as they worked to finish the field. By the time the last potato was covered, the first flakes of snow were beginning to drift down, landing softly on the dark earth they had prepared. That evening, the cabin was warmer than usual, the heat from the fireplace reflecting off the log walls and chasing away the chill. Caleb placed a larger portion of salt pork and a thick slice of fried cornmeal bread on Emily's plate, his eyes meeting hers for a silent second before he looked down. "You did a good job on that field," he said, his voice low and quiet. Sarah would have been proud to see it cleared. It was the first time he had spoken his wife's name to them without the shadow of grief. And Emily felt a deep sense of belonging settle over her as she looked at the swept floor and the fire crackling on the hearth. Lily sat on the stool by the fire, her head resting against Silas's neck as the old dog lay stretched on the warm stone, his tail thumping softly. The covenant they had made had become something more, a shared shield against the cold wilderness. They had food for the winter, a dry roof and a quiet peace that seemed as solid as the stone fireplace that warmed them. The fragile peace of the homestead was shattered 3 weeks later when the sound of hooves and the creak of leather saddles echoed up the ridge, breaking the quiet of a cold, grey afternoon. Out of the forest rode Marcus Thorne, a wealthy and ruthless cattle baron who ruled the lower valley with an iron hand. He was flanked by 3 of his hired riders, men with hard faces and heavy pistols holstered at their hips, their horses pawing the frozen mud of the yard with a restless, aggressive energy. Thorne was a large man dressed in a heavy coat of fine black wool and leather boots that bore no mud from the trail, his face handsome but marred by a cruel, arrogant sneer. He pulled his horse to a stop near the cabin door, his silver spurs jingling in the quiet air, and looked down at Emily, who stood on the porch with a broom in her hand, her heart freezing in her chest at the sight of him. He did not dismount, but sat tall in his saddle, his eyes sweeping over the newly cleared field and the low stone wall with a look of cold, calculating greed. The riders sat silently behind him, their hands resting near their gun belts, their gazes scanning the cabin as if already planning its destruction. "Where is Vance?" Thorne demanded, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man used to buying whatever he wanted. Emily did not answer but stepped back toward the door, her hand reaching behind to find the latch, her fingers trembling. Before she could open the door, it swung outward, and Caleb stepped out, his rifle held loose but ready, his face hard as flint. Thorne looked at the rifle, a mocking smile touching his lips, but did not pull his horse back. "Vance, I'm here about the spring on the ridge," the cattle baron said, his tone casual. "My herds need the winter water, and the records show your borders are invalid under the new Land Act. You don't have the improvements to hold this ridge, and I'm claiming the water rights. You've got until the 1st of the month to clear out, or my men will run the cattle through here." He pointed a gloved finger at the potato field Emily had cleared. "That little patch of dirt won't save you, and neither will that rifle." Caleb did not raise the rifle, but his grip tightened, his knuckles turning white. "The borders are legal, Thorn, and you know it," Caleb said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "My father cleared the first logs, and I've registered the covenant of labor with the land office. If you bring your cattle onto this ridge, I'll stop the herd, and then I'll deal with you." Thorn's riders moved their hands closer to their pistols, the air turning thick with a deadly friction that made Silas emerge from the barn, his lips snarling as he stood at Caleb's side. Thorn looked at the dog, then back at Caleb, his sneer deepening. "We'll see what the judge has to say about your land covenant and the drifting woman you're keeping up here, Vance," Thorn sneered, his eyes darting to Emily. "The town doesn't take kindly to homesteaders who harbor vagrants, and a man's word is only as good as his standing. You'll leave this ridge one way or another." With a sharp pull of his reins, Thorn turned his horse and rode back down the trail, leaving the yard filled with the cold dread of what was to come. The threat of Thorn's return hung over the cabin like a winter fog, turning every creak of the pines and every rustle of the wind into a source of anxious dread. Silas grew restless, no longer sleeping by the hearth but pacing the perimeter of the cleared field, his ears twitching at every distant sound. Emily slept with an iron poker beside her cot, her eyes wide as she listened to the wind howling through the shingles. The work did not stop, for they had to build a sturdier fence around the potato patch to protect the sprouts from frost. Caleb worked with a grim intensity, his axe swinging from dawn until dark as he felled young pines, his face set in a hard mask. One cold evening, the sound of gunshots shattered the quiet of the ridge, the rifles echoing as Thorn's riders rode close to the boundary, firing into the air to terrify the sisters. Emily ran to the window, pulling Lily close and holding her tight as the young girl began to cry, but she refused to let her own tears fall, her jaw set in quiet, stubborn resistance. Caleb came into the cabin, his rifle in hand, his boots leaving mud on the floorboards as he went to the window. "They're trying to scare us off," he said, his voice quiet but filled with a cold anger. "They want us to run so they can claim the ridge is abandoned before the judge arrives next week." Emily looked at him, her hands still shaking as she rubbed Lily's back to soothe her. "We cleared that land, Caleb," she said, her voice steady, her eyes meeting his in the firelight. "We planted those potatoes and we built that wall. I didn't survive the trail just to let a greedy baron steal the only home we have left. We stay and we fight." Caleb looked at her, the hardness in his eyes softening into silent understanding. He nodded once, the gesture solemn. "The town meeting is next Tuesday," he said, "and the judge will be at the courthouse. We'll ride down together and show them the covenant. If Thorn wants a fight, we'll give him one. But we'll do it where the whole valley can see the truth of what we've built." The morning of the town meeting arrived with a bitter grey light that seemed to freeze the air as Caleb hitched the team to the wooden wagon. Emily dressed Lily in her best linsey-woolsey dress, which she had carefully washed and mended by the firelight, trying to present a clean, respectable appearance for the townspeople. She combed her own hair and tied her wool shawl tight around her shoulders, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and quiet determination as she climbed onto the wagon bench beside Caleb. Silas sat in the back of the wagon, his grey muzzle resting on the wooden sideboard, his yellow eyes watching the trail as they rolled down the ridge and toward the valley. The ride to Pine Creek was a long, cold journey, the iron tires of the wagon crunching over the frozen ruts of the road, while the wind swept down from the snow-covered peaks, bringing with it the scent of pine and stone. As they drew closer to the settlement, the trail joined the main road, and they began to pass other wagons and riders, all heading toward the wooden buildings of the town. Pine Creek was a dusty, wind-swept collection of unpainted buildings, dominated by the courthouse that stood in the center of the muddy main street. As Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop near the boardwalk, Emily could feel the weight of dozens of eyes turning toward them, their gazes cold and filled with a judgmental curiosity. Thorn had already spread his rumors, painting Emily as an immoral woman who lived in the cabin under the guise of work, and the townspeople were quick to believe the worst of a drifting stranger. The local storekeeper stood on the porch of his shop and refused to look Emily in the eye, turning his back to sweep the street as they walked past. A group of women pulled their children close, whispering behind their hands and casting dark glances at Emily's worn skirt. Emily felt a burning flush of shame, her throat tightening, but she kept her chin lifted and her gaze fixed ahead, refusing to let them see her tremble as she held Lily's hand tight. She knew that her labor on the soil had been honest, and she drew strength from the memories of the heavy stones she had pulled. The courthouse was packed with homesteaders and ranchers from all over the valley, the air inside hot and thick with the smell of wet wool, tobacco smoke, and stove heat. The noise was a low, constant murmur of voices that fell silent the moment Caleb led the sisters through the heavy oak doors, the crowd parting before them with a cold, suspicious distance. Marcus Thorne sat at a long table near the front of the room, dressed in his fine black coat, his riders standing behind him with their arms crossed and their eyes scanning the room like wolves. The circuit judge, a grey-haired man named Miller, with a stern, tired face, sat behind a high pine bench, his spectacles resting on the bridge of his nose, as he turned the pages of a large leather ledger. Thorne rose from his seat as the judge called the case of the Vance homestead, his silver spurs clanking against the floorboards as he walked to the front of the room. He cleared his throat, his voice carrying the smooth, deceptive confidence of a man who believed the law was merely a tool to be bought and sold. "Your Honor," Thorne began, his voice echoing from the ceiling, "this ridge is a vital water source, and under the new Land Act, it must be put to productive use. Caleb Vance has left the homestead to go to seed since his wife passed, and the land is no longer improved according to the requirements. Furthermore, he is harboring vagrants of ill repute, a drifting woman and her child, who have no legal claim to this valley, and whose presence is a blight on the moral standing of our town." He pointed a gloved finger at Emily, his eyes narrowing in cold, public humiliation. "She is nothing but a trail-discarded beggar left behind by her family, who has wormed her way into a warm loft in exchange for Caleb's protection and food for a warm loft and a share of Vance's rations. The homestead is occupied in name only, and I ask the court to void the deed and grant the water rights to my ranch so we can put the land to proper use." A low murmur of agreement ran through the crowd, their eyes turning to stare at Emily with a cold judgment that made her feel as though she were standing in the freezing wind. Caleb Vance rose, his heavy leather boots making a slow, deliberate clanking sound as he walked toward the judge's bench. He did not look at Thorne, nor did he address the whispering crowd. His gaze was fixed entirely on the circuit judge, his face hard as the stone wall Emily had built. He reached into the pocket of his canvas coat and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, its edges worn and stained with the dark dirt of the ridge, and laid it flat before the judge. "Your Honor," Caleb said, his voice a low, steady rumble that silenced the room, "this is a legal covenant of labor, signed and witnessed when Emily first arrived. She has cleared 5 acres of overgrown briars and oak scrub with her own hands, pulling the stones and tilling the soil until her hands were raw and blistered. She has planted a crop of potatoes currently stored in my cellar, and she has mended the fences and kept the cabin clean. She is no vagrant, and she has earned her keep through honest, brutal work that would have broken most men in this room." He turned slowly, his dark eyes sweeping over the crowd until they settled on Marcus Thorne, his gaze so intense that the cattle baron took a half-step back. "She has more decency and honor in her little finger than Marcus Thorne has in his entire body," Caleb said, his voice rising until it filled every corner of the silent courthouse. "She worked the soil when the frost was biting, and she cleared the land that Thorne wants to steal without lifting a finger. The borders of my homestead are legal, and the land is fully improved under the law. I have kept my covenant with her, and she has kept hers with the land. If any man in this town wants to question her right to stand on that ridge, he can answer to me first." A heavy silence fell over the courtroom, the townspeople looking from Caleb's fierce face to the paper that Judge Miller was inspecting. The judge turned the paper over, his finger tracing the steady signature Emily had written, and then looked up at Marcus Thorne with a long, cold look. "The covenant is valid," Judge Miller declared, his voice final as he struck his gavel against the bench with a loud crack that echoed through the silent room. "The land has been cleared and improved according to the law, and the deed remains in Caleb Vance's name. This court will not tolerate the harassment of honest homesteaders, and Mr. Thorne is warned to keep his cattle and riders off the Vance Ridge. The case is dismissed. A murmur of approval broke out among the homesteaders in the back, many nodding in quiet satisfaction at the defeat of the cattle baron who had long trampled their rights. Thorne glared at Caleb, his face turning a furious red, as he realized he had lost his leverage over the spring, but he did not speak, knowing that to protest further would bring the judge's wrath. He turned and stormed out of the room, his riders following, the heavy doors slamming shut behind them with a hollow boom. Emily felt the weight of shame lift from her shoulders, replaced by a deep relief, while Lily wrapped her arms around her waist, her small face buried in her skirt as she let out a soft, happy sigh. Caleb walked back to the bench, his face still stern, but his dark eyes holding a quiet, warm light as he looked down at the sisters. "Let's go home," he said simply, and though the words were quiet, they carried the weight of a promise that Emily knew would never be broken. They walked out of the courthouse and down the wooden boardwalk, the townspeople now watching them with a quiet, respectful curiosity, some of them nodding in greeting as they passed the store. The ride back to the ridge was a peaceful, slow journey through the afternoon light, the wagon rolling over the frozen road while the first flakes of fresh winter snow began to drift from the sky. Silas sat in the back, his tail thumping against the wooden boards whenever Lily spoke to him, his ears alert to the sounds of the quiet forest. As they climbed the ridge, the snow began to fall in earnest, coating the dark fields Emily had cleared in a pristine white blanket that seemed to wash away the pain of the past weeks. The potatoes were safe in the root cellar, the cabin was warm and dry, and the covenant that had started as a desperate bargain on a freezing trail had forged a bond of safety and lasting peace that would warm them through the coldest winter.